Look, I haven't spoken about the issue of Ben Roberts-Smith and the federal court judgment in the case, as you know, that Mr Roberts-Smith brought against certain media outlets over his alleged involvement in the execution of unarmed Afghanistans. I've said many times in relation to the Brereton Report and Roberts-Smith that the process is not only flawed but damaging. Why would young men and women offer themselves to go to war and face this kind of treatment when they get home? So many returned soldiers have said to me, after difficult deployment, especially in Afghanistan, that what we face when we come home is far worse than what we face in the fields of battle. Mr Roberts-Smith has indicated he will appeal, but this was a trial of over 100 days. The event in question occurred about 10 years ago. The war in Afghanistan was an ugly war. The Taliban insurgents were waging total war against those who were occupying the country, including our brave men. The Taliban did not recognise, as Peter Westmore of News Weekly has splendidly pointed out, any distinction between soldiers and civilians. To quote Peter Westmore, any Afghan person who failed to assist the Taliban was regarded as a traitor and was liable to summary execution, his wife raped and his children sold into slavery. Every Afghan farmer was obliged to assist the Taliban, either carrying arms, supplies of ammunition, or acting as a spotter for the Taliban, part of the intelligence gathering operation. He writes, those who refused faced execution, and we know that many were murdered in cold blood, unquote. Peter Westmore makes a further telling point that soldiers are brutalised by war, and the longer the troops are exposed to the stress and extreme violence of combat, the more damaged they are. As he writes, because the SAS regiment consisted of volunteers, they were willing to volunteer for repeated tours of duty in Afghanistan. Without calling into question the bravery and otherwise honourable discharge of duty by the SAS volunteers, questions arise whether risks to fellow soldiers and non-Taliban Afghan civilians almost inevitably arise when soldiers are repeatedly exposed to combat in war. If this is indeed so, he writes, ought it not be military policy to impose a strict limit on the time that Australian troops are exposed to combat missions, unquote. Well, jealousy exists in every field of human endeavour. Ben Roberts-Smith was a mere corporal, one of the lowest ranks in the army. He was incredibly brave, won a Victoria Cross by charging Taliban machine gun positions in order to save the lives of other Australians. It's impossible not to be disgusted by what's been publicly said about this man, which brings me to this point. I repeat, this occurred 10 years ago. The allegations against Ben Roberts-Smith are grave. Are we to believe, whether they're true or not, are we to believe that none of this was known in upper ranks of the army? This was 10 years ago. Did army leaders, vastly superior in status to Ben Roberts-Smith, not know about these allegations? Years ago, no charges were laid. None were investigated. Were Ben Roberts-Smith's superiors sitting on their hands? If all of this is, as was alleged in a trial of over 100 days, that this young man was involved in the execution of unarmed Afghans, yet not one of his accusers would last 60 seconds in the confronting and impossible terrain on which these men fought. The enemy weren't walking around with signs on their chest, I'm the Taliban, and the enemy, or I'm not the Taliban. The Taliban didn't recognise any distinction between soldiers and civilians. There are officers in the Australian Army whose responsibility it is to maintain military discipline. If this conduct occurred, didn't they know? If it occurred, we're talking about 10 years ago, did they turn a blind eye? If they didn't know, shouldn't there be an investigation of the entire Army command structure? A brave young man has had his reputation destroyed and his career ended, with grave allegations made against him. Again, I quote Peter Westmore. It's hard to see this as anything more than the scapegoating of one man, guilty though he may be, when his superior officers, right up to the Chief of Army, get off scot-free with reputations intact. While the media claim the high moral ground in exposing criminal misconduct in the Australian Army in Afghanistan, what we're seeing, he says, is moral cowardice at the highest level, unquote. In other words, our soldiers have been betrayed. You will recall that in the Brereton report, the top brass were exonerated. The Blazer Brigade, the starched shirts, they were the commanders in Afghanistan. Which brings me to General Yamashita, who was hanged on February 23, 1946, for crimes committed by his Japanese forces in defence of the Philippines. Yamashita was not personally accused, not himself, of committing any crime, but he was court-martialed and hanged for, quote, failing in his duty as commander of the Japanese forces, unquote. The US Supreme Court upheld the decision that he be put to death because, quote, a commander can be held accountable for crimes committed by his troops, even if he did not order them, did not know about them, or didn't have the means to stop them. It's called the Yamashita Standard. It's been adopted by the Geneva Convention, and Australia is a signatory to the Geneva Convention. The Yamashita Standard is that the highest ranking officer is accountable for and should be prosecuted and convicted of the crimes of every officer and soldier under his command, even if he or she is unaware of that crime or was aware and actually gave orders to stop it. Ignorance of the actions, this is the Yamashita Standard, of his or her subordinates and failed attempts to stop them are not a defence. So by all means, bury Robert Smith in accusations of criminal behaviour. But how can we abandon the Yamashita Standard, where, quote, the highest ranking officer is accountable for and should be prosecuted and convicted of the crimes of every officer and soldier under his command, unquote. So who were the commanding officers when Ben Robert Smith was on duty in Afghanistan? I'm telling you, these people are currently the big brass, the Blazer Brigade, starched shirts, epaulets. You see them all the time. They were the commanders in Afghanistan. Why aren't they prosecuted? Or do we ignore the Geneva Convention to which we're a signatory? Hopefully his Robert Smith farce is not over by a long shot. But present and past SAS soldiers have to live with all of this. And you've got to ask, how many more years do politicians plan to torture Australian soldiers on the basis of an ABC report? In other words, you go to war, it's kill or be killed, and you now have to be careful who you shoot and why. But remember this, if you're not shot on the battlefield, they'll metaphorically shoot you when you come home. We're talking about buying nuclear-powered submarines in the defence of the nation. That's a critical responsibility of government. But the rank condemnation and vilification of Ben Robert Smith, primarily on the basis of an ABC report, means that as a nation, we seem intent on turning the armed forces into some kind of social laboratory. As Professor David Flint once said to me in an interview, and I quote him, just as well such an approach didn't apply in the Second World War, otherwise the rising sun would be flying over Canberra today.